The US, UK and France launch airstrikes on Syria. The targets suspected chemical weapon sites. Russia calls it an act of aggression and warns of consequences. What does this mean for the war in Syria? And will the strike stop chemical attacks against civilians? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Khouri Batibo. In what is the biggest military action against President Bashar Al Assad since the start of Syria's war 7 years ago, the US, UK and France have bombed multiple government facilities. The airstrikes targeted a research center outside the capital, Damascus, and 2 suspected chemical weapon storage sites near the city of Homs. The action was in response to an alleged chemical attack by Syria on civilians in the city of Douma last week. The Syrian government claims to have shot down many of the more than 100 missiles launched. And in Damascus, people celebrated on the streets, honking their car horns in a show of defiance. Now, the US and its allies say the strikes were aimed at deterring further use of chemical weapons. And President Donald Trump directly addressed Russia and Iran, the 2 countries supporting Syria's Bashar al-Assad.
I also have a message tonight for the 2 governments most responsible for supporting, equipping, and financing the criminal Assad regime. To Iran and to Russia, I ask, what kind of a nation wants to be associated with the mass murder of innocent men, women, and children? The nations of the world can be judged by the friends they keep. No nation can succeed in the long run by promoting rogue states, brutal tyrants, and murderous dictators.
Last night, British, French and American armed forces conducted coordinated and targeted strikes to degrade the Syrian regime's chemical weapons capability and deter their use. This was not about interfering in a civil war, and it was not about regime change. As I discussed with President Trump and President Macron, it was a limited, targeted and effective strike with clear boundaries that expressly sought to avoid escalation and did everything possible to prevent civilian casualties. We would have preferred an alternative path, but on this occasion there is none. We cannot allow the use of chemical weapons to become normalized.
Well, Russia has warned there would be consequences for the attacks. President Vladimir Putin said the airstrikes were an act of aggression against a sovereign state that is on the front line in the fight against terrorism and were committed without a mandate from the UN Security Council and in violation of the UN Charter. He said the current escalation around Syria is destructive for the entire system of international relations. History will set things right, and Washington already bears the heavy responsibility for the bloody outrage in Yugoslavia, Iraq and Libya. Now, while President Trump has said the airstrikes would continue until the Syrian regime's use of chemical weapons ends, his defense secretary described them as a one-off.
Clearly, the Assad regime did not get the message last year. This time, our allies and we have struck harder. Together, we have sent a clear message to Assad and his murderous lieutenants that they should not perpetrate another chemical weapons attack for which they will be held accountable. But right now, this is a one-time shot, and I believe that it sent a very strong message to dissuade him, to deter him from doing this again.
Now let's introduce our panel for today's Inside Story. Joining us in Moscow, Alexei, who is a Middle East specialist at the Russian International Affairs Council. In Beirut, Rami, a senior fellow and professor for public policy at the American University of Beirut, also a senior fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School. And in Arezzo, in Italy, via Skype is Joshua Landis, director at the Center for Middle East Studies at the University of Oklahoma. Gentlemen, thank you for being on Inside Story. Welcome to you all. Joshua, if I can start with you, was this military operation enough to achieve what the Americans say was their goal, to stop Bashar al-Assad from using chemical weapons again?
I believe it will be successful. The United States has had a large measure of success in this very narrow part of the civil war. And the use of chlorine gas had slipped under the radar. It wasn't included in the original Obama deal in 2013. They put it in later, but Assad continued to use it because it killed so few people. America overlooked it. This mistake is now being addressed by President Trump. I don't believe that Assad will try it again, but it's not going to affect, as all of your heads of state said, this is not about entering into Syria's civil war. Clearly, it's going to be a depressing sort of aftermath for much of the Syrian opposition and other states in the region that were hoping that President Trump would take the fight to Assad.
Rami, Khouri in Beirut, do you agree with Joshua? Last year's U.S. strike failed to change Bashar al-Assad's behavior. This time, will it be any different? Will he use chemical weapons again?
Well, I agree with Joshua. It'll send a strong message in a very narrow space for a very short period of time, and you might find 4 or 5 months down the road people testing again these red lines. I think it's important to remember that it was exactly almost 25 years ago that the United States bombed a site in Sudan that it said was was potentially a chemical weapons site that Al-Qaeda was using. Turned out to be a milk factory. But in the last 25 years, the Qaeda group has grown to be very big, much bigger all over the world than it was then, and other groups like it have grown. So the lesson is that military strikes alone cannot stop this kind of action or address the underlying dysfunctions that lead to it. And this is the challenge the Americans have. How do you combine any militarism with serious diplomacy and socioeconomic engagement to address the totality of the picture in Syria and other parts of the Middle East? And this is not happening.
Alexei Klebnikov in Moscow, Russia has warned that such actions would not be left without consequences. So how will Russia respond? How will they retaliate? In practical terms, what are the options on the table for Moscow?
Well, in the first place, Russia warned about consequences if its own objects and military personnel would be targeted and suffer from the strike. But eventually we can see that there were 0 casualties on the Syrian side and the Russian side. Russia's military objects and personnel stay intact. So this is why no reason for further escalation. So basically, if we look at this incident from a larger scale, we can see that actually all parties involved kind of ended up in a win-win situation. By striking, U.S. kind of stick to its word, delivered on its promises, and appeased its domestic hoax who were propagating, more aggressive moves towards Assad regime, and also appeased its foreign allies.
So
Russia
you don't
also
think
wins
the
because
Russians
it didn't lose its image, and Syrian regime also won because it suffered only limited damage of its infrastructure and had 0 casualties.
So you don't think the Russians are going to take any action at all?
If we're talking about military action, no, I don't think so.
Okay.
No one is interested in further military escalation because ultimately everyone understands if the conflict will grow in between U.S. and Russia in military terms, that would can spin out of control quite quickly. So no one is interested in that.
Okay. Joshua Landis in Arezzo, we don't have confirmation yet what chemical weapons were used or who was responsible. I mean, the OPCW hasn't actually completed its work in Douma. Even if we did have confirmation that chemical weapons were used, is it legal under international law for the Americans, French, and British to take this unilateral military action in Syria?
That's a very good question, and I don't know the answer to it, not being a lawyer. Clearly, the United States has done this on numerous occasions. The UN Security Council has not challenged America's actions, and even if it were to challenge it, obviously 3 of the members of that Security Council are carried out this strike. So it's very unlikely that any international body could uphold the law, even if they decided that America had broken it. So, the major policemen of the world were doing the bombing.
All right. Rami, Khouri, your thoughts on this. Is it legal under international law? And what consequences for the Americans, British and French, if any? Because the Russians are accusing them, of course, of violating the UN Charter, of violating international law by conducting this unilateral action.
Well, Joshua was right, as usual, that whatever happens in the Security Council is going to be vetoed by one party or the other. The Russians will veto anything that takes place in Syria. The Americans consistently veto anything that takes place in Israel and Palestine. So the Security Council is immobilized as a peacemaking body when you get the interests of the great powers involved. But on the initial question, as far as I know, international law allows you to use preemptive military force if there is a direct and imminent, immediate, clear threat to your national well-being. In this case, there obviously wasn't. That Assad wasn't attacking Americans. Unlike, say, the Qaeda attack against the U.S., when the U.S.'s retaliation, many people thought was, the 9/11, many people thought that was legitimate. But this is not about the fine points of the rule of law. This is about big power, kind of neo-imperialist actions, whether it's the Russians or the Americans doing it. They're both acting in similar ways. The French and the English join in, the Iranians join in, the Turks join in a little bit now, the regional powers. But this is really a story about people who have military force and they use it. The difference is that the Russians are much more subtle, patient, and nuanced and strategic about how they react to issues like this. They find the openings that have been created by American military blunders, and they go in there, as do the Iranians. So if you look at Iranian and Russian influence in Syria and other parts of the Middle East, compared to 15 years ago, it's enormous. The Iranians and the Russians are everywhere, and the Americans are gradually losing influence other than being able to carry out military attacks. So I think we should look for a non-military response from the Russians and the Iranians, and I expect that to happen.
So what would this all mean for the war in Syria? Gentlemen, let's just remind our viewers now of the different actors in Syria. The situation is extremely complex with different global powers fighting for control. Russia, which has forces mainly on the Mediterranean coastline, a permanent airbase at Latakia and a naval port in Tartus, supports the Syrian president. Bashar al-Assad is also backed by Iran, the Lebanese group Hezbollah, and other militias who have been battling a spectrum of rebel groups opposed to the Syrian regime. Moderate rebel factions are mainly backed by the US, which is also leading a coalition that includes Kurdish fighters to get rid of ISIL. This has angered America's NATO ally Turkey, which considers the Kurds a terrorist group and a threat along its border with Syria. Ankara has recently launched an offensive north of Syria to clear the area of Kurdish fighters. Alexei Klebnikov in Moscow, how far is Russia willing to go to support Bashar al-Assad?
Well, as Moscow reiterated numerous times, it's not supporting the person of Assad. It supports the state structures, the institutions, the state from collapse. And as usual, Moscow puts as an example the story of Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, where the collapse of state institutions basically ended up in a chaotic situation. So this is the first thing. Russia, it claims to support not the regime, but the state sovereignty institutions. Secondly, about how far Russia would go, it's very complicated situation in terms of that many experts see as Russia having a huge leverage over Assad. So if to look at this from other angle, Russia is kind of trapped itself in this situation because it cannot back up, it cannot withdraw, because if it decides to do so, to seize its support to the Syrian government, then it will kind of undermine all this 3, 4, 5 years of its policy of support to the regime, and it will lose its image, its power, and there will be like long-term consequences for Russia's presence in the Middle East. So this is why it's very complicated in terms of like how far Russia will go. But this is why it's important to underline that it's in Russia's genuine interest to finish the conflict, to find a political solution as soon as possible, as quick as possible.
Joshua Landis, but does Russia still have leverage over Bashar al-Assad, as Alexei Klebnikov suggests there? If Russia were to have a stern word with Assad today, would he listen?
It's not clear that what he'll listen to. Of course, Russia has tremendous leverage, just the way the United States does over Israel. But Assad can do much as he pleases, because he has the Russians and indeed the Syrian people over a barrel. If he is to go, and if you got rid of Assad and his family, it's very possible that the state of Syria would collapse. Because who would take power? If one Alawite general tried to take power, it's not clear that he could hold it. Other generals would vie for power. There would be coup after coup, just as Syria suffered before the Assad family consolidated its position. This is the problem with the Syrian opposition. It's very divided. There are over 1,000 different groups. They don't agree on anything. It's very unlikely that the men under Assad would agree on anything once he's gone. So the Russians have to treat him with kid gloves, because if they just got rid of him or kidnapped him, the whole Syrian state could collapse, and Syria would then fall into chaos, and this would be terrible for Russia. So that's the dilemma. It's also the dilemma for the Syrian people, because they don't want chaos, they don't want the kind of militia warfare they see in Libya or Afghanistan, but at the same time, of course, they want change, and nobody knows how to bring it in a peaceful way.
And as you say, nobody knows how to bring change and who's going to bring it. Rami, Khouri in Beirut, I mean, what consequences now for the war in Syria? The message that Western powers seem to be sending here is that they're concerned about chemical weapons and what Bashar al-Assad does with them. They're concerned about ISIL, but should they not also be concerned about conventional weapons that have been used against civilians in this war? 500,000 people have died as a result of conventional weapons. I mean, the message they're sending to the Syrian civilians, to the Syrian people, surely is, something that must disappoint them.
The message that the Americans, French, and British are sending is really very mixed. They probably are genuinely concerned about the awful use of chemical weapons, but they're not genuinely concerned about the deaths of Syrians. The French and the British and the Americans collectively in the last century have been responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Arabs, the injuries of hundreds of thousands, and the displacement of tens of millions of people over the last century. The French have been fighting in the Middle East since Napoleon. So we have to be really hard-nosed when we analyze the motives of these Western powers. And I think the Russians are pretty much in the same boat. I wouldn't let them off any more easy. These foreign powers will do anything they want in these Arab countries, because the Arab countries have not been able to pass the test of sovereignty or statehood, cannot protect themselves, cannot take care of their people, and open themselves up both to the kinds of civil wars that they've suffered and then the foreign interventions. And my last point is that what's going to happen in Syria is that Turkey, Russia, and Iran primarily will meet over and over, as they've been for the last year, to try to find a way to wind down the fighting inside Syria, and then to find a way to move to some kind of political transition in which Iran and Turkey primarily dominate the scene from outside the borders, and the Russians continue to have strategic interests there, and the sovereignty of Syria will be diluted, but at least the fighting will be over and people can try to live a normal life. And most Syrians would accept that in the short run, because they can't continue to live in this kind of warfare and mass human degradation.
Alexei in Moscow, what would it take for Russia, for this war to wind down, for them to withdraw out of Syria? What is the end game, basically, as far as they're concerned in Syria?
Well, as I already mentioned, and I agree with my colleagues, that it's quite complicated situation, because it's the more variables in the equation, the harder to solve it, and it's exactly the case. But to underline one important thing, that as I already mentioned, it's very important for Russia to finish this conflict sooner rather than later.
But what does finishing the conflict mean? What does finishing the conflict mean? We've seen President Trump tweet today, mission accomplished. For Russia, what would mission accomplished look like?
Apparently, it's the situation where the Syrian government takes control of the majority of rebel-held territories, and the Geneva-based political process, which will end up in the new constitution, transitional period, and elections. So that's what Russia wants to finally implement. And exactly for that reason, all those additional supportive platforms in Astana, in Sochi, were launched to basically try to kind of make the Syrian opposition, which is highly fragmented, as Joshua rightly mentioned, highly fragmented and disunited. And that is exactly an attempt to kind of try to bring them to some unity, to then kind of launch and accelerate the political process. Because now it's not only Assad who doesn't, who is not interested in, in compromises, but also in opposition, because it has lots of factions. It's disintegrated,
right?
And they also cannot come to some basis for further negotiations.
Joshua Landis, President Trump tweeted earlier today, mission accomplished, but as we know, it's far from being mission accomplished, is it, in Syria? Even though Assad has made huge gains over the last year territorially, he still doesn't control the whole of Syria. Is there anyone that can stand against him? And what would constitute mission accomplished, for Western powers in Syria?
That's a tremendously important question, and we're all confused because we heard Tillerson, who's now been fired, head of the Secretary of State, say that America was going to stay in Syria for the long haul, and it was going to try to use its leverage by owning a third of the country in the north and perhaps 50% of its most important resources, was going to try to displace Assad. That is not clear. Today, Trump has said he wants to get out, and even in the middle of this message of the strike, he said American troops will come home soon. So if he, in fact, carries through with this promise of coming home soon, that will throw open a third of Syrian territory, or close to it, in the north. And Assad will line up to rush troops in there. Turkey will, of course, try to hit the Kurds. It could be quite destabilizing. But what we're seeing today in this sort of endgame is Syria being divided into three sections, one an American section in the northeast, a Turkish section, and it looks like Turkey will take Idlib province as well and add that to its gains, and then Assad in about 62-63% of the country, sewing up his gains as he did most recently in Douma. So Syria will remain fragmented, it'll remain poor, and it's likely that this struggle between the great powers and regional powers over Syria will continue, but not on the battlefield, perhaps on a much more diplomatic level. But it's going to hurt the Syrians as a people.
Rami, Khouri, I'll give you the last word. Coming back to this action that we've seen from the US, France, and the UK, the last two major Western interventions in the Middle East didn't go very well. They were disastrous. And I'm thinking here of Libya and Iraq, of course. Where is Syria headed right now?
Look, it's been clear since Trajan, the Emperor Trajan in Roman days, that you cannot use military power in the Middle East if you're a foreign imperial power and expect things to go your way. You can dominate local situation for a few years, maybe a few decades, but in the end, the foreign power leaves. And this is what we're going to start seeing happening here. In Syria, we have the problem that 100 years ago and today, we have a repetition of the situation where foreign powers, European powers 100 years ago, today with Russia and Iran and Turkey involved, are shaping the future of Syria and trying to handcraft it in a way, even writing constitutions for the Syrians. So this struggle for Syria, this struggle to define Syria, to own Syria, to control Syria, is going on now like it did 100 years ago, and it's going to continue to go on until one day, somehow, the Syrian people can be self-determinant, can define themselves, and we hope that will happen after a transition period where the foreign powers might bring about the end of the fighting, and then a transition could take place after that.
Okay, thank you very much, Rami, Khouri, and Joshua Landis, and Alexei Klebnikov for a very interesting discussion. Thank you for joining us on Inside Story. And thank you as well for watching. You can always watch this program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, of course. Our handle is at AJ Inside Story. From me, Folie Batibo, and the whole team, thank you for watching. Bye for now.